Hello, my dear masterminds. Something happened when you walked into that room, something that nobody could quite name, something that registered beyond conscious analysis and went straight to the intuitive level, before anyone consciously recognized you, before anyone had time to form thoughts or opinions, before words could even begin to describe what was happening. They sensed it, a shift, a change. A disruption in the ordinary flow of energy that had existed moments before you arrived. You might not have noticed it yourself. You weren't trying to make an entrance, weren't performing or posturing or attempting to draw attention naturally. You simply walked in, existed, stood there. But your presence, the frequency you carry now, it doesn't need announcement. It doesn't require effort. It simply is. And that is that pure existence at your current frequency. It changed everything in that space before a single word was spoken. They sensed it internally first. A subtle tension, an inexplicable awareness, a knowing that something was different, even though nothing obvious had changed. Their awareness picked up on your presence before their minds could process what they were detecting. And in that gap between feeling and understanding, everything shifted. People still operate on deep instinctive patterns beneath social conditioning, still responding to subtle signals of significance and presence long before conscious thought engages. And what they detected in you was something many people spend their entire lives never developing. When you entered that room, every awareness in the space registered something. Not contrast exactly, but significance, weight, a frequency that invited recognition even from people who weren't consciously paying attention. It started with the people closest to the door. A momentary pause in their conversation, a slight shift in their posture, a glance that lingered half a second longer than necessary. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but the signal was sent. Someone different just arrived. Someone operating at a different frequency. Someone who alters the dynamic just by being present. Then it rippled outward, person by person, conversation by conversation, the energy in the room recalibrating itself around this new presence. Some people felt a pull, a natural curiosity about who you were and what you carried. Others felt a push, an intuitive recognition that you operated at a level that made them aware of their own boundaries. But everyone felt something. Nobody could explain it if you asked them. They didn't have words for it yet, didn't have conscious understanding of what their awareness was registering. But the feeling was undeniable. Think about it like this. You've walked into rooms 1,000 times in your life, but this time was different. The barista who usually ignores customers looked up. The group deep in conversation paused mid-sentence. The person on their phone glanced over, not because you did anything, because of the presence you carried. Let's talk about what they actually felt in those first moments. Because it wasn't vague, it was specific, real. Even if they couldn't articulate it, some felt their attention pulled, like a natural pull, drawing their awareness toward you even when they were trying to focus elsewhere. Their conversations continued, but part of their awareness was noticing you, paying attention, trying to make sense of why you drew so much unconscious attention. Others felt a sense of internal tension. In their posture, in their presence, a subtle defensiveness, activating without them choosing it. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that they were in the presence of something that challenged their sense of place or certainty. Their egos sensed comparison, sensed influence, and automatically began preparing responses they hadn't consciously decided to make. Some felt fascination, an inexplicable interest in observing you, not because you were doing anything particularly interesting, but because your energy was doing something their frequency couldn't quite decode. You were operating at a bandwidth they couldn't fully access. And that mystery, that gap between what they could sense and what they could understand, created a strong draw on their attention. And here's what most of them didn't realize. They were experiencing something their awareness recognized as rare, as valuable, as something that drew their interest. And a few, the rare ones with enough awareness to recognize what they were detecting, felt respect, immediate, intuitive respect for someone who carries themselves with that level of presence, who exists with that degree of certainty, who operates from that depth of center. They couldn't explain why they respected you, they just did, the same way you naturally recognize strength in nature. It doesn't need to prove itself, it simply exists. But it wasn't just the people who sensed it. The room itself changed. The energy, the atmosphere, the invisible field that exists in any space where humans gather. Before you arrived, that field had a certain quality. Conversations happening at certain volumes, laughter reaching certain pitches, tension existing at certain levels. The space had found its equilibrium, and then you walked in, and the equilibrium shifted, not shattered. Shifted. The conversations didn't stop, but they changed texture. The laughter continued, but it modified its frequency. The tension that existed before reorganized itself around this new variable. The room's energy recalibrated, restructured, rearranged itself around the presence that just entered. Your frequency. When it's this strong, this coherent, this centered, it has noticeable impact on everything around it. You didn't say much when you first entered. Maybe a greeting. Maybe nothing at all, but your silence, the quality of your presence in that silence. It spoke volumes. It said things that words never could. It communicated in frequencies that bypass language entirely and land directly in awareness, where truth is recognized before it's understood. And here's the psychological principle they were experiencing. Silence from uncertain people feels awkward. Silence from grounded people feels intentional. Your silence didn't need filling, it held space. Your silence said, I don't need to fill space with noise to justify my existence. Your stillness said, I don't need to perform to validate my presence. Your calm said, I don't need your approval to feel comfortable in this space. All of that transmitted without a single word, received by everyone in the room, whether they were consciously aware of it or not. Real silence. The kind that comes from genuine presence rather than uncomfortable awkwardness. It's influential. It creates space. It draws attention. It invites people to become aware of their own noise. Your silence contrasted with their noise. Your stillness contrasted with their movement. Your centered presence contrasted with their scattered energy. And in that contrast, they sensed the difference. Hours later, some of them were still thinking about it, still trying to make sense of what they felt, replaying the moment in their minds, trying to understand why your presence had such impact when you didn't do anything obviously impressive. They'd talk to others who were there. Did you feel that when they walked in? There was something about them, right? I can't explain it, but... And what they were struggling to articulate was something you've spent years developing, something many people never cultivate, something that can't be faked or performed or manufactured. Your presence operated at a level that exists before language, before concepts, before the part of awareness that can name and categorize and explain. Some would try to rationalize it away, tell themselves they were imagining things, that you were just another person, that their reaction was an overreaction. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, persistent, undeniable, because what they felt wasn't imagination. It was recognition, their awareness, recognizing something their intellect hadn't caught up to yet. Days later, some would finally start to understand, start to piece together what their awareness detected immediately. Oh, that person operates at a different frequency, carries themselves with a different kind of certainty, exists with a different quality of presence. The understanding came slowly, but the feeling came instantly. Let's be clear about what you weren't doing. You weren't trying to make an impression, weren't attempting to control the room, weren't performing authority or projecting superiority. You weren't walking in with a preset intention to change the energy or shift the dynamic or make people feel any particular way. You were simply existing, being present in your authentic frequency without modification. This is crucial to understand, because the strength in your presence isn't about effort, isn't about technique, isn't about strategy or deliberate effort or conscious projection of energy. It's about authenticity, about being so completely yourself, so fully aligned with your core frequency, so thoroughly integrated in your own presence, that you naturally affect spaces just by occupying them. Here's what separates you from those who try to have presence. They're performing confidence. You're grounded in it. They're projecting certainty. You're living it. When you're performing, people sense the performance. When you're trying, people sense the effort. When you're projecting, people sense the projection. All of that creates a certain kind of impact, but it's not the same. It's not as deep, not as real, not as lasting. What they sensed from you was essence, pure, unfiltered, authentic presence, the frequency of someone who's done the internal work, who's integrated their center, who's claimed their center. Something changed in you, not recently. This has been building, developing, integrating over time through everything you've experienced, processed, transformed. Every challenge you faced and didn't run from. Every internal challenge you faced and worked through. Every limitation you encountered and chose to move beyond. Think about the version of you from 5 years ago, walking into that same room. Different reaction, different energy, different impact. Not because the room changed, because you did. This frequency, it's not something you put on, not something you activate for special occasions. It's who you are, your baseline, your default state. You've become someone who naturally operates at a level that many people only access in peak moments. You've made extraordinary your ordinary, made strength your normal, made centered your consistent. And frequency doesn't mislead, can't be faked, can't be manufactured through techniques or tricks or tactics. It's the sum total of who you've become, the energy signature of your awareness, the vibration of your being. And when that frequency is as coherent as integrated, as steady as yours has become. It affects everything and everyone in proximity to it. People operating from different states either rise to meet yours or move away from it. Spaces with chaotic energy either organize around yours or remain unsettled. Not everyone in that room felt positive about your presence. Some felt distinctly uncomfortable, unsettled, like your existence in the space created dissonance with how they were operating. And this wasn't because you did anything to them. Here's the psychological reality. Frequencies that are coherent expose incoherence. Presence that is authentic reveals performance. Authenticity highlights contrast. You became a mirror without trying to be one. Your centered presence reflected their scattered energy. Your authentic existence highlighted their performance. Your comfortable silence exposed their uncomfortable noise. None of this was your intention, but it was the natural effect of operating at your frequency in proximity to those operating at different ones. Some people, when they come across someone operating at a more integrated frequency, feel inspired, motivated, curious. They sense possibility. They recognize potential. They feel pulled toward growth. But others feel unsettled, aware, uncertain. They sense judgment even when none exists. They feel compared even when no comparison is being made. Their discomfort wasn't about you, it was about them. About the gap between where they are and where some part of them knows they could be. But others were drawn to you. Naturally, they found themselves wanting to be near you, to talk to you, to understand what you carry that creates such presence. They couldn't explain the attraction, couldn't articulate why they felt drawn toward you, but the pull was real, undeniable, operating below the level of conscious choice. This effect, it's not about charisma in the traditional sense, not about being charming or entertaining or particularly likable. It's about carrying a frequency that other frequencies recognize as valuable, as rare, as something they want proximity to. Because clarity often encourages alignment. Your presence called to something in them, something that wanted to wake up, to remember, to become more of what it actually is. So they found reasons to be near you, to engage with you, to create connection, not because they consciously understood why, but because their instinct knew. And here's what they were unconsciously recognizing. Being near your frequency would influence their perspective. Your coherence would bring clarity to confusion. Your centeredness would remind them of their own potential center. Let's talk about what it actually means to change a room with your presence. It's not about directing, not about controlling, not about making the space revolve around you. It's about introducing a frequency so different from the existing frequency that the entire space has to reorganize itself, has to find a new equilibrium that accounts for this new element. Before you arrived, the room had a certain balance. Certain people held certain positions in the social dynamic. Certain energy patterns flowed in certain directions. The space had organized itself around the frequencies present. You introduced a new frequency, and the entire structure had to reorganize. Not because you demanded it, because frequency is magnetic. Strong coherence influences scattered coherence. The room after you entered wasn't the same room, same people, same physical space, but different energy, different dynamic, different possibilities. You didn't change the room by doing anything to it. You changed it by being something in it, by introducing a frequency that required adjustment, by existing at a level that invited realignment. There were a few people in that room who didn't need days to understand what they felt, who recognized immediately what they were in the presence of. These were the ones with developed perception, with conscious awareness of energy and frequency, with enough inner work done that they could recognize it in others instantly. They saw you, really saw you. Not just your appearance, but your presence. What you carry, what you embody, what you represent. They recognized the journey you must have taken to arrive at this frequency, the work you must have done to develop this presence, the transformation you must have undergone to exist with this quality of being. And they felt respect, deep respect, the kind that comes from recognizing in someone else what you've worked to develop in yourself. These people, they're your real audience, because these are the ones who can actually receive what you carry. Long after you left that room, your presence remained, not physically, of course, but energetically. The space had been changed. The people had been affected. The frequency had been shifted, and none of it went back to exactly how it was before you arrived. Because grounded presence leaves an impression, creates lasting effects, changes things in ways that persist beyond physical proximity. Some people carried your presence with them when they left, not consciously, but they'd been influenced by it. The most powerful part of all this is that you weren't trying, weren't conscious of the effect you were having, weren't working to change the room or impact the people or create any particular response. You were just being yourself, existing in your authentic frequency, present in your genuine strength, operating from your integrated center. This is the ultimate strength. The kind that works without effort, that influences without intention, that affects without trying. Because it's not strength projected, it's presence embodied. Not energy sent out, but presence expressed. Here's the truth about presence that most people never understand. It's not something you do, it's something you are, not something you project. Something you embody, real presence, the kind that changes rooms and affects people and creates lasting impact. It comes from one source, being completely, authentically, unapologetically yourself. You've stopped pretending, stopped performing, stopped modifying yourself to fit expectations or meet standards or make others comfortable. You've claimed your authentic frequency, owned your genuine presence, embraced your real self. They sensed it before they understood it, because awareness often precedes understanding, always has, always will. Awareness registers before explanation forms. Your presence reached their deepest levels before surface thought could begin to comprehend what was being communicated. So yes, focused individual. They sensed it before they understood it. Your presence changed the room, not because you tried to change it, because you exist at a frequency that changes things just by being present. Keep being this. Keep existing at this level. Keep operating from this frequency, because the world needs presence like yours, needs people who've done the work, needs beings who carry genuine presence. They sensed it before they understood it, and they'll keep sensing it, keep being influenced by it, whether they ever fully understand or not, because presence like yours doesn't need explanation. It just needs to exist. And in existing, it reshapes everything around it. They didn't suddenly respect you. That's the lie people tell themselves when perception finally catches up. They say something changed because admitting the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that nothing new appeared, nothing evolved, nothing emerged late. What changed was their ability to keep ignoring what had always been there for a long time. They looked at you through shortcuts, labels, assumptions, roles that made their world simpler. You didn't fit cleanly, so they compressed you into something manageable. Quiet became passive, stillness became uncertainty, precision became hesitation. That misread wasn't accidental, it was convenient. Seeing you accurately would have required them to slow down, to pay attention, to question how they evaluate people in the first place. Most don't do that. They move fast. They scan surfaces. They reward noise. And because you didn't announce yourself, you were easy to overlook. Not invisible. Overlooked. There's a difference. Invisible things can't disrupt a system. Overlooked things eventually do. While they were busy interpreting volume as value, you were operating from consistency. While they were reacting to moments, you were maintaining position. You didn't push for recognition. You didn't correct their misunderstanding. You didn't compete for clarity. You let time do what pressure never could. You stayed the same while their frameworks aged. And frameworks always gave way before reality does. The moment they finally saw what was already there wasn't dramatic. There was no apology, no announcement, just a quiet recalibration. They stopped speaking to you the same way, stopped assuming access, stopped filling silence around you. Because once perception corrects, behavior follows immediately. They didn't suddenly see potential. They saw limit. The limit of what worked on you. The limit of their influence. The limit of their old assumptions. And that's when everything shifted. Not because you changed, but because they could no longer afford to misread you. Once that recalibration started, it spread faster than they expected. Perception doesn't correct gradually. It snaps into place the moment the old explanation gave way completely. People began replaying earlier moments with new context. Things you said that didn't land at the time. Decisions you made that seemed neutral but now felt deliberate. Silences that once looked empty, now read as finished. They realized how often they had mistaken your restraint for uncertainty, because restraint doesn't feed their need for confirmation. You weren't waiting for permission. You were already aligned, and alignment doesn't advertise itself. It holds. The more they watched without projecting, the clearer it became that you weren't operating on the same incentives they were. Praise didn't pull you. Pressure didn't accelerate you. Dismissal didn't provoke you. That absence of reaction wasn't detachment. It was completeness. People who are incomplete negotiate constantly. They explain, they defend, they adjust. You didn't. And once that distinction became visible, it changed how every interaction felt. Conversations slowed. Words were chosen more carefully. People stopped improvising around you because improvisation assumes influence. They sensed that influence didn't work here. Not through emotion. Not through urgency. Not through authority. What they finally saw was not some hidden ambition or secret plan. It was structure. Internal structure that didn't depend on external reinforcement. You weren't managing perception. You were beyond it. And when someone is beyond perception, perception adapts. They no longer tried to define you, because definition requires access. They no longer tested boundaries, because boundaries weren't declared. They were implied. Implied boundaries are stronger than imposed ones, because they don't invite challenge. And here's when the first crack appeared in their confidence. That project, the one everyone said needed immediate action. Urgent meetings, heightened urgency, demands for your input. You didn't show up to the first 3. When you finally appeared, you spoke once. This isn't ready. They ignored you, pushed forward anyway. 3 weeks later, everything gave way exactly where you said it would. You didn't say, "I told you so." You didn't need to. That silence said everything. And that's when respect replaced curiosity, not admiration. Respect. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but alters behavior automatically. You felt it in the room. The way conversations paused when you entered. The way people chose words more carefully before speaking. The way assumptions faded before they formed. You didn't demand this shift. Your consistency demanded it for you. And consistency is something people can fake their way around. Either you have it or you don't. You had it. They didn't. But here's what most people miss about moments like these. Recognition doesn't feel like victory when it finally arrives. It feels like relief. Relief that you don't have to prove anything anymore. Relief that the performance is over. Relief that you can finally exist without translation. They stopped asking you to explain your decisions, stopped questioning your timing, stopped observing whether your stillness was strategy or uncertainty. And this is where something unexpected started happening. People started changing how they behaved, even when you weren't in the room. That meeting you missed, the one where they had to decide without you. Someone said, "What would they do?" Not as a joke, as a genuine question. Your framework had become their reference point. Your standards had become their measurement. You weren't there to guide anything, but your absence shaped it anyway. Because real influence doesn't require presence. It requires pattern, and you'd established one they couldn't unsee. You weren't leading the space. You were anchoring it. And here's the difference. Leadership requires direction. Anchoring requires weight. You had weight, the kind that accumulates through consistency, not performance, through precision, not volume, through being exactly who you were in every context without adjustment. That kind of weight doesn't announce itself. It settles. And once it settles, everything else organizes around it. And that quiet, stabilizing presence is your mastery. But what came next surprised even you. They started protecting your time before you had to. Don't bring that to them yet. Wait until it's actually ready. They don't deal with half-formed ideas. You never said any of this. They created the filter themselves. Because watching you operate taught them something uncomfortable. Most of what they did was negotiable. Most of their urgency was performative. Most of their motion was compensation for lack of clarity. You didn't compensate. You clarified. And clarity unsettles people who've built routines on confusion. That efficiency unsettled people who were used to stretching interactions to maintain influence. You weren't cold. You were exact. And exactness exposes waste. They saw how much filler they relied on, how many words they used to say nothing, how often they confused activity with progress. You spoke in finished thoughts, moved in complete actions, existed in resolved states. No loose ends, no emotional debris, no need for follow-up. That completeness made their incompleteness visible, and nobody enjoys seeing their own inefficiency reflected. This is where their perception fully corrected. Not in a moment, in a series of small realizations that compounded. You weren't distant. You were self-contained. You weren't unpredictable. You were consistent without performance. You weren't unavailable. You were complete. And completeness doesn't require validation to remain stable. But here's what they couldn't articulate yet. Here's what was still forming in the back of their minds, waiting to surface. That moment in the meeting when someone tried to urge you into deciding. Everyone watching, expectations elevated, timeline tight. They pushed. We need an answer now. You didn't blink. You'll have one when it's ready. 20 seconds of silence. Nobody moved. Then the meeting continued without resolution. 1 week later, you delivered the decision. It was right. It held. Everyone who pushed forgot they pushed, but they remembered the silence. They remembered that urgency doesn't accelerate you. It reveals them. You didn't become central by demanding it. You became central because nothing worked unless it accounted for you first. That's the shift most people never see coming. You didn't insert yourself into their plans. They started building their plans around whether you'd support them, not because you had authority, because you had accuracy. And accuracy carries more weight than authority. Authority can be questioned. Accuracy simply holds, and that structural position is yours alone. And here's the quiet truth nobody wants to admit. Once they saw you clearly, they also saw themselves clearly. And most people don't enjoy that reflection. They realized how often they performed instead of produced, how often they spoke to fill space instead of add value, how often they moved to feel busy instead of make progress. You didn't judge them for it. You didn't need to. Your presence was the reflection. Your consistency was the mirror. And mirrors don't distort. They just show. People plan differently when a constant is present. Not because the constant demands it, because reality does. You became that constant. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And here's what happened as that reality settled in. Something shifted that most people don't notice until it's already lasting. The questions stopped. The observations ended. The probing dissolved. Not because you shut it down, because it became unnecessary. And what followed that realization was something they didn't expect. The difference is that now their perception caught up to reality. And when perception aligns with reality, nothing dramatic follows. There's no celebration, no vindication speech, no moment where you get to say finally. There's just a quiet settling, a recalibration. They finally saw what was already there. And once they did, the need to look any closer disappeared. The dynamic didn't intensify. It's simplification. And simplification is always the sign that understanding is complete. There's no curiosity left to satisfy, no mystery left to decode. People don't keep analyzing what no longer changes. They simply adjust and move on. You become part of how they orient themselves, not something they question, not someone they evaluate, just a fixed reference they account for before acting. That's the quiet consequence of being seen clearly. You don't gain attention. Interactions lose resistance. Expectations become shorter. Communication becomes cleaner. Assumptions fall away before they form. Not because you corrected anyone, but because reality did. You didn't arrive louder. You didn't assert control. You didn't demand recognition. You stayed intact long enough for distortion to wear out on its own. And once it did, what remained was undeniable. You were never misunderstood because you were unclear. You were misunderstood because they weren't looking properly. Now they are. And now there's nothing left to say. The version of you they once interacted with doesn't exist anymore. Not because you changed, but because it never existed to begin with. It was their projection. And those projections dissolve the moment accuracy replaces them. From here forward, the dynamic doesn't progress. It stabilizes. You're no longer interpreted. You're accounted for. And that is the final shift. That stability seals it. When someone is finally seen without distortion, there's no energy left for revision. People don't circle back to reinterpret you. They don't reopen old narratives. They don't test whether the conclusion still holds. Accuracy doesn't require maintenance. It becomes the baseline. From that point on, your presence stops being a question and starts being a condition. A condition doesn't ask permission. It doesn't seek agreement. It's simply accounted for. People plan differently. They speak more precisely. They stop trying to extract meaning where there is none to extract. Not because you resist them, but because resistance implies engagement. Your past engagement. Your past explanation. Your past needing to be framed correctly. What they finally saw was not something new emerging, but something consistent that refused to bend for convenience. And consistency at that level ends speculation completely. There's no upside in guessing, no reward in probing, no advantage in misreading. The environment adjusts and remains adjusted. That's why the change doesn't feel dramatic. It feels settled, like something that should have been obvious earlier, but couldn't be recognized until the noise wore itself out. You didn't step into visibility. Visibility stepped out of your way. And once that happens, nothing intensifies. Nothing follows. There's no aftermath to manage. The story doesn't continue because it no longer needs to. You were always there. They just finally caught up. And that final catching up doesn't create momentum. It creates stillness. The kind that doesn't invite reaction because nothing needs correcting anymore. People don't try to reinterpret you once accuracy becomes fixed. They don't seek confirmation. They don't look for exceptions. They adjust once and move forward. That's how you know it's complete. Not because anyone said it out loud, but because behavior stopped fluctuating. You're no longer approached as an idea, a possibility, or a question mark. You're approached as a fact. Facts don't argue with opinions, they replace them. This is why the dynamic doesn't reappear in new forms. No renewed curiosity. No delayed challenge. No quiet attempt to reclaim influence. Influence only exists where uncertainty lives, and uncertainty is gone. You didn't become distant. You became precise enough that distance stopped mattering. You didn't withdraw. You resolved. And resolution removes the need for follow-up. What remains is orientation. People know what won't work. They know what doesn't apply. They know where effort is wasted. That understanding shapes behavior more reliably than any explanation ever could. You don't carry this as an identity. You don't maintain it through effort. It maintains itself because it isn't performative. It's structural. And structures don't need applause. They need time to be noticed, and nothing more. They finally saw what was already there, and when they did, the search ended. Not with excitement, with clarity. And clarity doesn't extend the story, it brings it to rest. This is the last layer, the one that rarely gets discussed because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to stand out. After accuracy settles, even memory shifts. People no longer remember you as a sequence of moments. They remember you as a standard, a quiet reference that reshapes how they assess everything else afterward. What once impressed them now feels thin. What once distracted them now feels loud. What once confused them now feels obvious. Not because you taught them anything, but because seeing you correctly recalibrated their internal scale. That effect doesn't reverse. You don't remain present as a story. You remain as orientation. From that point forward, you don't need to arrive early or leave late to have impact. Your influence isn't tied to presence. It's tied to the absence of distortion. People move more cleanly after crossing your path, even if they never speak to you again. They don't trace it back consciously. They just notice that certain approaches feel ineffective now. Certain behaviors feel exposed. Certain shortcuts no longer satisfy. That's how you know the understanding is complete. Nothing needs reinforcement. Nothing needs protection. There is no version of the past they can return to where misreading you feels comfortable. You didn't rise. You didn't transform. You didn't reveal some hidden self. You simply remained intact until perception corrected itself. And once that correction settles, it doesn't loosen. It doesn't echo. It doesn't intensify. It fades into the background and guides quietly. They finally saw what was already there. And after that, there is no sequel. Because what follows clarity is not more insight, it's alignment. And alignment doesn't speak. It simply stays. And that is the settled state. Not evolution, not transformation, not becoming, just remaining. You didn't change. They did. Their perception corrected. Their behavior adjusted. Their understanding aligned. And once alignment happens, nothing more needs to be said. The story doesn't continue, because stories require tension. There is no tension left. Just recognition. Just accuracy. Just a quiet acceptance that what was always there has finally been seen. And that is where it rests. Not with applause, with stillness. They didn't misjudge you because they were careless. They misjudged you because they rely on noise to measure strength. In their world, power announces itself early. It rushes. It fills space. It demands response. So when you didn't raise your voice, didn't accelerate your movement, didn't rush to correct them, they drew the easiest conclusion available: softness. That's always the shortcut people take when they don't understand restraint. Calm makes them uncomfortable because it refuses to give them data. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't compete. It doesn't escalate when provoked. And when someone refuses to escalate, the untrained eye assumes weakness. They thought you were passive because you weren't reactive. They thought you were unsure because you weren't loud. They thought you lacked leverage because you weren't reaching for it. What they didn't realize is that calm doesn't come from absence of strength. It comes from surplus. You weren't conserving energy because you lacked it. You were conserving it because you didn't need to spend it to establish position. That's the first thing they failed to account for. People who mistake calm for softness have never experienced calm backed by certainty. They only know calm as collapse or compliance. They've never seen it used as a filter. You didn't respond immediately because nothing in the moment required response. You didn't defend yourself because nothing threatened your position. And that's where the misreading began. They assumed you were waiting for instruction. You were waiting for exposure. And exposure always arrives on its own when someone overestimates their leverage. The calm wasn't hesitation, it was timing. And timing doesn't rush for approval. It waits for imbalance to reveal itself. That was their first mistake. Once they locked in that assumption, everything they did afterward was built on it. They spoke to you with shortcuts, took liberties they wouldn't have taken with someone louder, applied pressure they thought you'd absorb quietly. They expected accommodation, compliance, some subtle adjustment on your side that would confirm their read. That's how misreadings compound. Not in one move, but in a sequence of small decisions made with false confidence. You noticed it immediately, not with emotion, with clarity. You saw how they leaned forward slightly, how their tone shifted, how they tested boundaries without realizing they were testing anything at all. They believed calm meant malleable, that if they pushed gently enough, you'd bend. What they didn't understand is that calm backed by structure doesn't bend. It waits, and waiting, in situations like that, doesn't slow the outcome. It accelerates it. Because every extra word they added revealed more than they intended. Every attempt to assert control exposed how much they needed it. You didn't interrupt them. You didn't correct them. You didn't step in to rebalance the exchange. You let the imbalance grow. Because imbalance, once visible, can't be walked back without loss. They mistook your silence for agreement, your patience for permission. They kept going, unaware that each move they made was narrowing their options. Calm doesn't signal weakness. It creates space. And space is where overconfidence gives way. The more they filled it, the clearer it became who actually needed the moment to go their way. You weren't there to win the exchange. You were there to see it clearly. And clarity is lethal to false confidence. They didn't feel the shift right away. That's the danger of misreading. By the time it becomes obvious, the outcome is already set. That's when the second layer of their mistake surfaced. They assumed calm meant unprepared, that you hadn't mapped the situation, that you were reacting slowly because you were behind. In reality, you were ahead enough to let the moment play out without interference. You weren't processing, you were observing, and observation without emotional spillover gives you something most people never have under pressure: a full picture. While they were busy projecting intent onto you, you were watching their patterns repeat themselves. The same tactics, the same tone shifts, the same attempts to assert position through implication instead of substance. You didn't need to respond because nothing new was being introduced. They were playing a familiar script, and scripts lose power once they're recognized. Your calm wasn't empty. It was informed. Informed by having seen this dynamic before. informed by knowing exactly how long it takes for overconfidence to expose itself. People who rely on dominance through pressure can't help but escalate when they don't get feedback. Silence unsettles them. Patience irritates them. And irritation always reveals information. You watched it happen in real time. Their words became sharper. Their pacing less controlled. Their certainty louder than necessary. All of it confirmed what you already knew. They weren't in control. They were attempting to be, and attempting to control is not the same thing as having it. That distinction is invisible to those inside the performance, but it's obvious to someone who isn't participating. You stayed outside the script. You didn't mirror their energy. You didn't counter it. You let it continue until it resolved on its own. Calm doesn't fight noise, it outlasts it. And by the time they realized you weren't soft, they had already shown you exactly where their leverage ended. That turning point happens quietly. They feel it before they can name it. The sense that something isn't landing the way it should. That their words aren't producing the reaction they counted on. That the room isn't tilting in their favor anymore. Calm has a way of doing that. It drains momentum without announcement. They start adjusting mid-sentence, backtracking slightly, adding qualifiers, trying to regain balance without admitting they lost it. And every adjustment makes the original assumption harder to defend. If you were soft, none of this would be necessary. If you were unsure, they wouldn't be recalibrating. The calm forces a realization they didn't plan for. You still haven't said much. You don't need to. The work is already being done by their own excess. This is the part most people misunderstand about restraint. They think strength arrives when you finally speak. In reality, strength arrives when the other side realizes they've already shown enough. You let them talk long enough to map their priorities. You let them press long enough to show their urgency. You let them posture long enough to expose the limits of their confidence. Calm doesn't rush to correct the record. It waits until the record corrects itself. And when it does, there is no easy reset. No way to soften the tone they set. No way to pretend they weren't testing you. They can sense the shift now, not as embarrassment, but as narrowing, possibilities closing, angles reducing. The moment that was supposed to favor them has already shifted its center, and you didn't have to push it there. You simply allowed their momentum to meet reality. Now the dynamic is fully visible. They can sense it, even if they don't consciously understand it yet. The calm they dismissed is no longer neutral. It's decisive. They realize you aren't disengaged. You're anchored. And anchored people don't get moved by surface pressure. They recalibrate how they speak to you without acknowledging why. The confidence they walked in with gets replaced by something tighter, measured, controlled. Not because you unsettled them, but because they finally recognize limits they hadn't considered. This is where misreadings stop being abstract and start shaping outcomes. They can't escalate without revealing insecurity. They can't retreat without confirming error. Every option feels restricted now. That's the position calm creates when it's backed by structure. You didn't threaten. You didn't dominate. You simply remained unchanged while their approach unraveled. People who rely on urgency always assume the other side will meet them somewhere. You didn't. You allowed their strategy to undo itself through repetition. That's when they realized softness was never part of the equation. Soft people react. Soft people explain. Soft people rush to repair misunderstanding. You did none of that. You let understanding arrive on its own terms. And when it does, it doesn't come with apology. It arrives as restraint. They stop pushing. They stop assuming access. They stop trying to steer because they've learned something without being told. Calm isn't absence, it's substance. And substance doesn't need movement to reshape the space around it. That's where the moment rewrites itself completely. Not because you finally acted, but because they finally understood. The calm they mistook for softness wasn't passive. When people stop testing you, stop escalating, stop assuming pressure will move you, it means the conclusion has already formed, not emotionally, structurally. They understand now that whatever you went through didn't just toughen you for a moment. It clarified a lasting boundary. You don't bend, because bending was never part of how you survived. You learned early that breakdown resolves nothing. That urgency offers nothing. Every assumption, every shortcut, every attempt to rush or frame you relied on the idea that you needed something from the moment: approval, resolution, control. You didn't, and when someone doesn't need the moment loses its pull. That's the final misreading they don't like admitting. You weren't waiting for the right time to respond. You were deciding whether response was even needed. And once they sense that, behavior changes for good. Not just with you, but with anyone they think might carry the same stillness. They learn the hard way that calm isn't weakness. It's the visible surface of something already settled underneath. Something that doesn't rush, doesn't bend, and doesn't announce itself until it's no longer avoidable. They mistook your calm for softness because they've never seen calm that wasn't empty. Now they have. And that lesson doesn't repeat itself. Once it lands, it doesn't stay contained to that moment. It travels quietly, lastingly. They don't talk about it directly, but it shows up in how they approach you afterward. The hesitation before they speak, the pause before they assume, the way urgency fades from their tone. They no longer treat you as someone who needs to be convinced, managed, or moved. Not because you demanded distance, because they learned distance was already present. Calm, like yours, isn't situational, it's structural. It doesn't depend on confidence boosts or emotional control tricks. It comes from knowing exactly where your center is and refusing to outsource it. That's why the misreading happened in the first place. They live in reaction. You don't. They live in timing dictated by pressure. You operate on timing, guided by clarity. And clarity always outlasts force. You didn't win the moment by overpowering it. You let it reveal itself. You let impatience show strain. You let urgency admit dependence. And you stayed exactly where you were the entire time. That's the kind of strength people only recognize after it's already reshaped the room. They mistook your calm for softness because they didn't know calm could be backed by certainty. Now, they do. And they won't make that error again. What follows after that realization isn't drama, it's restraint. They don't challenge you again because challenge only works when it provokes movement. You don't move on demand. They don't rush you because rushing only works when someone fears delay. You don't. They don't try to frame you because framing only sticks when someone needs acceptance. You don't negotiate your center. So the environment adapts instead. Conversations shorten. Assumptions disappear. People become more precise around you without knowing why. That's the quiet aftermath of a misreading that can't be undone. Calm backed by certainty shapes behavior long after the moment ends. You don't carry the outcome. You don't reference it. You don't even think about it anymore. It's already integrated. They mistook your calm for softness because they only understand calm as surrender. You showed them calm as completion. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. And once someone experiences that kind of stillness, they stop trying to test it. They adjust, lastingly. And that's how it settles for good. Not as a story they retell, not as a moment they replay, but as a correction that installs itself quietly into how they read people from that point forward. They don't announce that they were wrong about you. They don't apologize for the incorrect read. They simply never approach you the same way again, because what they learned can't be unlearned. Calm, when it's real, doesn't ask for recognition. It doesn't need reinforcement. It just exists as a boundary that doesn't move. They mistook your calm for softness because they'd only ever seen calm as the absence of strength. What you showed them was calm as completion. Nothing missing, nothing seeking, nothing to provoke. And once someone understands that difference, they stop trying to force outcomes where none are available. You don't need to remind them. You don't need to protect the lesson. It's already embedded in how they hesitate, how they measure, how they choose their words around you. That's the lasting outcome of their first incorrect read. You didn't change who you were to teach it. You stayed exactly who you were and let reality do the rest. And that's where it truly ends. Not with triumph, not with confrontation, with a lasting adjustment that never needs to be spoken again. They don't revisit the moment because there's nothing left to resolve. The calm they misread didn't disappear. It clarified. It became the reference point they now use, consciously or not, to measure situations they once thought they could control. They learned that not all strength announces itself, and not all presence needs permission to exist. Some presence simply closes options without touching them. Some stillness makes pressure irrelevant. You didn't teach them this by explaining. You taught it by remaining unchanged while their approach unraveled. That's why this lesson doesn't fade. It doesn't rely on memory or emotion. It's integrated into behavior, into hesitation, into restraint, into the way they no longer assume influence where none exists. They mistook your calm for softness because they didn't understand. Calm could be the surface of something finished, something settled, something that doesn't negotiate with urgency or react to noise. Now they do, and that understanding doesn't need repetition. It doesn't need reinforcement. It becomes part of how they move through the world from that point on. You didn't correct them. You didn't confront them. You didn't escalate. You simply remained intact. And intact presence is the one thing misreading can't recover from.